Okay, so you're in the Royal Air Force doing engineering. So at that point, because I took a little bit of a different route in my attempt to become a fast jet pilot, so the processes were obviously designed for entry into that role, even though achieving that role is something we'll probably talk about as well, because there's so many barriers in place to sort of filter you into various different categories. What did a sort of day in RAF engineering look like when you started? What were you doing, and what was the ultimate goal at that point?
Well, I mean, I was doing my degree, so I was really at the Royal Military College of Science, Shrivenham, which was then Cranfield Institute of Technology, but has now Cranfield University. And so I was studying a degree, doing what you would expect. But then in the summer holidays, we had to go and do workshop practice. I mean, brilliant. I learned how to do sheet metal work. I used a lathe. I did all sorts of really interesting, proper hands-on engineering work, which I absolutely loved. And then I remember going to Bruggen in Germany for a couple of weeks and sort of living on a squadron and experiencing that, but from, again, the lens of becoming an engineering officer afterwards. And I graduated in 1989 with my degree, and then I went on my officer training. And it was that summer that the government announced that women were allowed to start flying, and they were allowed to only fly in multi-engines and helicopters, not in fast jets.
Okay. And is that when you decided you want, because again, you're training to become an officer, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a pilot,
no,
or that you want to be a pilot. So when we're talking about that penny dropping, did a penny ever drop? And
the penny hasn't dropped yet.
It still hasn't dropped.
The penny's still floating around.
Achieved all of this.
We're going to get there. I promise you, we'll get there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Building up to that. So right, fighter pilots, that's still not allowed. That's still illegal. But you can be rotary wing, fixed wing pilot. You wanted to go for that at that point?
Not quite.
No.
Let's be completely honest.
Okay, I'm enjoying the build-up.
All of the girls were brought in who were on the officer training and said, government's just announced this. You haven't had the opportunity to do your aptitude tests because it wasn't available. Would any of you like to? And I shot my hand up. And I shot my hand up because it was at Biggin Hill and I was at Cranwell, and meant that I could travel home and have a cup of tea with my mum. And the reasons that I signed up weren't, because again, I still didn't really know what being a pilot was. It wasn't something I would have even considered or thought about. And then I went off and did my aptitude tests, and it was whilst I was doing my aptitude tests, I thought, oh my goodness, I can do this. This makes sense. And my mum and dad met at a fencing club. And of course, you know what parents are like. They taught us all to fence. So I'd been fencing from the age of 7. And if you think about what fencing is, it's really about your hand-eye coordination. It's about speed of response, reaction time. I mean, to such an extent that I had practiced for hours and hours lunging and catching a glove that someone dropped over and over and over again, which of course builds neural pathways. And so my brain just felt like it knew what it was doing. And that was the point. I was like, oh my goodness, this is something I could do. That was the point. The first penny half dropped, probably. It's a halfpenny.
Okay.
If they still existed.
And I'm going to bring this to a point where there might be people listening or watching that, because you mentioned the aptitude test, don't exactly know what that is. And I may have a limited understanding of it, which is that this is to measure certain qualities in the person to determine what type of aircraft they're suitable for.
I don't think it determines what type of aircraft yet. That will come during flying training and your assessment through that. It will, however, determine whether you have the right minimum standard as judged by all of the theory that they will have already done. And, things might have changed in the years since I did them to pass, because it's a really hard training course that you're going to go on. There's only so much money. So you have to become so much budget for each pilot. So you have to become good enough quickly enough. And they want to have the right caliber of aircrew who are able to do the job. So definitely you need to be able to do that. But like I say, I think if I'd played lots of computer games, so I don't know how they judge it now with so many more people playing computer games. It's just my brain had been trained in a way that set me up really well to go and become a pilot.
Yeah, it was my interpretation of it was that it's like the provisional test that you do, when you sit in front of a TV screen when you're doing your driving license and you've got to click every time there's a hazard, and what the aptitude test is doing. Again, this is my understanding and may be completely wrong, and please correct me, was almost to measure your response times and the way you react to things, which is, so when you mentioned the fencing and the fact that you're well drilled, that would have obviously transferred into the aptitude test and helped.
And there is something, even now, and, as you get older, of course, your response times are supposed to decrease. Even now, if something drops, I've caught it before my brain has even recognized that it's dropped. I've gone, oh, my hand's there. So again, I think we've learned so much about the brain in the last few years and neuroplasticity. I just think it's fascinating how you can train it and how you can develop it, albeit it probably needs some level of aptitude still. You need to have certain characteristics, and also in my experience, to become a good pilot, capacity is really important as well. How you manage your working memory, how you organize your brain to be able to make, especially when you're making decisions at speed.
Yeah, we're now talking about being a pilot, but we still need to get the other half of the penny to drop. So you've gone for this. So you've gone for this aptitude test so that you can have a cup of tea with your mum. Yeah. And then what happens?
So I enjoyed the aptitude test, thought this is great. And then my head said to me, I have this ongoing narrative said, don't worry, you won't, your eyes won't be good enough. You'll fail the medical. So again, I had no expectation that I would be able to go and do that. Again, whether that was a limiting belief, it's really difficult to remember now, so many years on. But certainly I remember going for the medical and that's intense because they measure all sorts of different bits of you because you need to fit in the cockpit. And of course, they said that it was quite unlikely because I'm not very tall. I'm 5'4", that I would fit. And I was in fact right on the minimums to be able to do that in all of the different lengths. My eyesight was good enough. It had deteriorated, but it was still better than 20/20. I think what's really interesting is that I am the average size for a woman in this country. But I was right at the minimum to fit a cockpit because, of course, it was designed around the average man so many years ago.
Of course, yeah.
And so again, when we start to shift and change things, you have to think about design as well. How are we making sure that we are getting the biggest pool of people to be able to give them the opportunity to use the talents that they have? Because it is about finding, the wider the pool, the more the talent that will be in there for you to select and for you to get the best people to do the job.
And now moving on to aircraft. Obviously, I work with aircraft. I've got a passion for them. I'm fascinated with them. You had to start somewhere. So it was still illegal for you to be a fighter pilot at that time, but you went through the aptitude test. And how did you get your wings?
It didn't bother me at that point at all. I just, I was 21 years old. I'm suddenly told that I've graduated from IOT, and the day after they say, by the way, you're not doing your engineering officer training. In 2 weeks' time, you're starting at Swinderby and learning to fly. It was the most exciting thing ever. Before you even fly, though, you had to do ground school. We did survival courses. So there was a lot to go with it. But again, having just done an engineering degree, it's really easy to then go and do, aerodynamics and meteorology and all of the different parts. So I loved all of that. And then I had my first trip and I just fell in love. I fell in love as we got airborne to the sort of peace that you get up high up above the sky. There is something to me that just feels like I'm at home. And in fact, I was lucky enough to get a trip in a Typhoon just a couple of years ago. And it felt really strange going back to jump into a jet at the age that I'm at. And I thought, well, what are people going to think? And so there were all the normal anxieties that people have when you go and do something again. And I just remember I sat in the seat, I was in all the kit, remembered how heavy it all is. And we closed the canopy, and I just remember feeling that smell of aviation fuel. And I felt like I was at home. I felt like I was sat back on my sofa. And so there is something for me in the air that the only other place I have felt that is deep down underwater scuba diving. So there's something about those two extremes that just, feels a really comfortable place for me to be.